good. Lance, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, this will be a lot of fun. I'm really interested to get into what you do for a living because it's very different than what some of the other guests on this podcast probably are doing in the world. You're involved with artificial intelligence and machine learning. So tell me a little bit about your journey, how you came to all of this technology and the pivot that brought you to ecology and landscapes.
It's a big question. I'll tell you sort of the starting story, and I'll try to keep my sentences fast because I have a tendency to wander into dream worlds. The short of it is, in the beginning, I was studying physics. I was working for NASA as a planetary physicist. I was actually interested in sort of the origin and distribution of life, not only across the planet, but across the universe. I actually had funding from the National Science Foundation and from NASA for an astrobiology program. It was a great program because I got to meet folks from across literally all of the sciences that lead up to sort of Earth science plus, thinking about an astrophysical perspective of Earth in and of itself. So my bachelor's thesis was on planetary formation and ultimately the formation of Earth. And eventually I started to think, okay, let's focus more on this planet. And I also was very tuned into the problems of our time. So I remember as an undergraduate, something that I got an award for after graduating from the University of Florida was for starting a think tank. It was a public policy think tank. This is also going to be some news. But basically, it was about 20 students, and I was their sort of like tribal leader. And our mission was really, how do we basically, sort of address some of our biggest problems of our time? And so we had things like climate change and economic productivity. I mean, we were across the board. It was like everything you might think a policymaker sort of looks at in their portfolio. And I just remember looking for the way to sort of help to address some of our biggest problems, in particular, clean energy was something that I got pretty excited about. And I remember I remember going to China for a summer, and basically I was in Chengdu, China for 3 months learning Chinese. And the fog, or not the fog, the smoke from the exhaust fumes was so suffocating that as soon as you get off the plane, you could smell it and taste it. But I remember after being there for a couple weeks, I was thinking to myself, there's no policymaker in the world who's going to fix this. And I really thought hard about this moment where I was like, how can I change this? How can I fix this? And eventually, I turned back to something that I was exposed to in astrophysics modeling, which was computing. So for me, it was like, okay, so I think if I can, with computers, offer some sort of a free market solution that the Chinese would adopt and that everyone could adopt, that might lead to some solution for that particular problem, which was carbon emissions and these sort of large industrial issues that are very deeply ingrained and still are. But my point is basically that was my sort of focus on, okay, I'm going to understand computers and I'm going to be able to take computers so that way we can automate solutions at an industrial scale to some of our biggest problems. And so I had some funding from the US Department of Energy for my master's program. It was for smart grid systems. Again, this is not something that I sort of advertise or disclose. It's not because I don't want to, it's just because my story sort of took a lot of turns and I just try to simplify it for people. But there was a point when I was basically really focused on how can you sort of use computer technologies to control energy systems. And I think that was when I first got my first exposure to artificial intelligence, because I was starting to see that these technologies were basically statistical models, and there was some sort of cyber physical exposure that they were training me in. So they taught me electrical engineering, computer science, a lot of these hard disciplines. And they were expecting me to go do something with energy systems. But for me, as soon as I realized that the core of it that was most interesting was the AI, and this was just one problem that AI could solve, I was completely hooked. And so my story continues where I basically started getting into AI at the core, fundamental algorithms, because I'm realizing, wow, I can maybe not just solve energy systems problems, but really all of the problems that I was looking at with the public policy think tank, because suddenly I have some sort of a tool that I can begin to sort of think about optimizing solutions at an industrial scale for many of our world's most pernicious issues. So, okay, but basically if you fast forward to an opportunity that I saw in a computer science laboratory, and it was actually a neuroscience computer science laboratory. Again, I'm going a million miles per hour here, but just trying to take you through.
Take your time. Yeah, this is fascinating.
Yeah, basically, so I'm sort of getting into AI, and basically, this is like 2011, 2012, and I remember basically having done a little bit of research in my physics course. I took a biophysics course. This is going to be sort of two parallel tracks here. I took a biophysics course, and I remember asking the teacher basically told us, this professor at University of Florida, and she says, every biological process can be broken down into fundamental physics. And so again, we're sort of on a parallel track here, but basically she was like, hey, think of any biological process, you can reduce it to physics equations. And I was like, okay, if that's true, then that means my mind could be broken down into physics equations. And I was like, haha, no way that could be true. And so I went ahead and did, for my this was before graduating, a sort of senior, it wasn't quite a senior thesis project, but it was pretty close to it, where basically was looking at studies of the human brain. And I asked the question, well, how are memories formed? Like, let's start with like one part of the human brain, and eventually getting into the connections between synapses and what we call sort of dendrites, these sort of tree-like branches in the mind that connect with each other dynamically based on experiences. So right now you're actually changing some of your synaptic connections because you're learning, hopefully. And same with our viewers. But the point is really simple, which is starting to get a biological basis for what today we describe as artificial neural networks, but there's actually a very close connection. So in fact, like when I did that paper, I didn't really think I was going to do anything with it. 2 years later, saw this neuroscience laboratory doing computational neuroscience for AI, and they were saying, hey, do you want to, like, they were looking for anyone who was willing to take this job, because it was this very like strange world of modeling the brain, but modeling AI. It was biological and artificial intelligence combined. We would be in conversations and having these strange conversations about the nature of intelligence.
So what time frame was this? Because it sounds like you were studying and getting interested in AI really in the early days, before it really blew up, and we started to learn about it in the real world.
This is the truth. So when I was in Boulder, Colorado, where I was at last week, I actually got a chance to visit for other reasons. But basically, when I was in Boulder, Colorado, I remember spending time on a river and reading these publications from some of these people who today, like one of them, let's just say that they're recognized as sort of, founders of AI today. And at the time, there was basically these guys publishing, and maybe if you want to sort of maximally estimate, it's like a couple hundred graduate students on all of these papers, and sort of people at Google, people in the Department of Defense who was funding this work. So there was not a lot of people funding it, and but there was just starting to be the first demos that this is really powerful. So I can't sort of assume that I'm like the 200th person. I'm probably in that wave of like the next 10,000 or whatever who sort of, got a chance to be exposed to these technologies very early on. I watched as the field grew exponentially. I watched as all of a sudden my mom's asking me about deep learning, and I'm like, how do you know about deep learning? But my master's thesis in 2013, 2012, 2013, was called Parallelized Deep Neural Networks for Distributed Intelligent Systems. And so I was like, all right, I'm pretty sure this is going to be able to solve a lot of problems. So I'm just going to name it really broadly. But the whole point is basically, at some point I started to realize that this is so powerful. These technologies are so powerful that, probably most of the world's problems can be solved through them, and then more problems can be created through them. And there's something that I would just say, because you ask about the pivot to ecology, you ask about the pivot to the nature, and this is where you get to it. And the real story is that, I'm being funded by the Department of Defense. I'll just say that at some point, someone suggested to me that, hey, your sort of, AI system that you've been building for us, we could reuse it for, other things, ha ha ha. And I'm just like, man, that's scary as hell. And I'm like contributing to this. And so basically, at some point, I start to realize that I don't want to build killer robots. So that's like okay, number one. And number two, I'm looking around at who else is hiring. There's Google. I'm like, I don't want to build ad tech. It's like I'm not interested in ad tech. It's not what I want to do with my life. That I started to just look for a different path. But the fact is that I also realized that I would just say I sort of foresaw that there's going to be all these great things with it, and then there was some sort of opportunity to literally create AI that has more destructive power than you would ever want to even talk about. But the fact is that when you're sitting there and you're solving these hard math equations and you're going through these problems, you realize that these are systems that are, there's sort of fundamental game changers in sort of the flow of information and power on the planet. So, okay, like at some point I realized, how can I not create killer robots, and how can I guarantee that the AI that I create is literally going to be beneficial for people first and foremost, starting with that foundation. I don't think it hit me right away that I would be building AI for nature and for wildlife restoration and for, enhancing the functioning of ecosystems and all of these things that we'll talk about. But I think in the beginning, it was this one constraint that I needed to make sure it was going to only benefit people.
Don't be evil.
Don't be evil. Don't build killer robots. So that was it. And yeah.
Well, I guess that's an important direction to set for yourself, and challenging when you're working in the field of AI because of the inherent power and potential of the technology.
Seriously. And there's a lot of ways, not just all the way to killer robots, but there's sort of the intermediate levels of lost integrity. And so meaning there's a lot of in-betweens that you just don't want to do. You just don't want to do anything bad with this technology because you realize it's so powerful you would accidentally cause some sort of bad outcome even if you didn't fully intend it. So basically the point being, constraining AI was sort of in my book from day one. And, I'm watching as others are doing things, and I'm watching as people who I wish were not doing these things but are building weapons today. And I'm just like, it's such a sad and scary story. But the fact is that I'm motivated by this idea that maybe natural environments bring greater sense of sort of cortisol reduction, and this, maybe we could just literally serenade people to sleep with a peaceful sense of environments. This is sort of a joke, but the reality was I needed sort of to find how I was going to help people, and I think that didn't come until 2015. Basically, I was further studying at Columbia University in computer science, machine learning, really getting my ass kicked by some of the mathematics and computing challenges that I thought I sort of knew what I was doing after my master's thesis. I studied further at Columbia University, and I was like, nope, don't know what I'm doing, and I had really better sort of rewire how I think about these things, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to solve the problems that I'm solving today. And so I'm there, and I'm kind of depressed because I'm in New York City, and New York City can be a kind of brutal place, but also because I'm still thinking about these issues that I'm telling you about. And I have to say, it was probably a human being, a person who really kind of took me out of this. Basically, he was my basketball friend. We were playing at the International House of New York City, which is over 100 countries of graduate students at Columbia University are all represented here. There's 700 students. It's this really unique place. It's this institution with a $25 million endowment that they just fund people to do whatever they want. And I'm playing basketball in this very nice gym, and this guy named Steve would always show up, and he was my Karl Malone, and I was his John Stockton, and so I would pass him the ball and he would score all the time, and we built a good relationship in the basketball court. One day we were on the subway, sort of oh, you want to go south? I got to go south. And we start sort of arguing, I would say, about the sort of, the way that cities are run and everything. But sort of his whole thing was well, how would you do it better? Because he studied urban planning at Cornell University. He was class president, very charismatic, very, very positive, charming person. I would say I'm much more of a sort of intense person than he is. He always asks you how your family's doing. He's that kind of a person. He's a great guy. And basically, I was well, look, you could use a neural network to encode these things. And he's what are you talking about? No, you can't. There's no evidence of this. And I'm yeah, I did it for my master's thesis. You can encode this data, and we can run an optimization on it and we can get better results than what they're currently doing. And he's like, of course there was a lot more conversations that would come out of that. So fast forward about a year later, he's totally sold that neural networks are as capable as they are. I proved that to him. We sort of built things. I was like, here, look, Steve. And then he's like, holy shit, this thing is way smarter than I ever thought. And now there's obviously so much evidence of that today in everyone's lives. But what I wanted to kind of just really quickly say is that he was the one who told me about this sort of idea that, one of we both were wondering, how can we measure the value that we create for people? Especially like, how can we make sure that you have AI that sort of is optimizing the value creation to society? And how would you know that you're doing that successfully? Like, how would you sort of not do anything else, like we said, but what would be the metric that you optimize? It was a tough question. Eventually, we landed on one metric, which I still find to be a North Star for all of the work that I'm doing, and that is real estate value.
Real estate value?
Yes.
Okay, this is interesting.
It's very interesting, because what we find is that, and you see this, and I know there's the landscape architecture industry, the nursery industry, there's a strong connection, so I know you understand this industry fully. And what I would just say is that we took the lens on the industry that if you take all of the space that people live in and that they work in and everything like this, and you try to measure how people are feeling in that space, then if they were sort of consistently feeling better, that would show up in the value of the property. That was our thesis. And so, a pretty simple thesis, but the reason why it was so important to sort of have that fundamentally be correct is because then we were like, okay, let's go all in on researching sort of what is it that drives more or less real estate value. Not even related to nature at all. We didn't assume any of these sort of variables that now today I'm like, wow, this is it. But, there was no assumption there. And so we were living in New York City. I had some data science capabilities. I was able to sort of download data sets of all of these real estate projects and really run an analysis on, all the different sort of multivariable things that can drive real estate value. So it was interesting. We were looking at like, art, cafes, sort of different cultures, migration of people, all kinds of things, parks. And we started to tune into one project in particular that sort of from the ROI was a huge outlier. It was not even close. Like it was like sort of first of all, several orders of magnitude greater in terms of the amount of investment return to the local real estate owners. But also it was just way bigger than any other project that we saw. And that was the Highline Gardens in New York City.
Okay.
So this was sort of the moment. It was like an inflection moment right there.
That's fascinating. I think it doesn't strike me immediately as the obvious metric when you say real estate value.
Yeah.
I definitely have to think about that.
Yeah.
But I can see the correlation, and it does make a lot of sense. The more we improve a space and environment, and the more people feel good in an environment, the more they want to be there, the more demand there is for that space, you would expect the values to increase.
Yeah, I mean, at least there's obviously like exceptions in these things,
sure.
But it felt like a good, and I would say today it still holds, and it's not the only one. Now I realize you need to do more than just optimize real estate value. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But it was at the time the North Star, and whenever I find myself coming too far from that, I'll always come back to sort of orient my work towards that outcome. It is the largest asset class in the world. It's $200 trillion globally. Is sort of invested in all of our properties, so if you're sort of looking at ways to create a multiplier at that scale, and so you get very fundamental about what you're actually looking at in terms of the sort of, I guess, the physics of it or whatever you want to call it, but you're really focusing on the underlying dynamics. So yeah, I would say we could talk about the value driver, sort of, if that's a good rule or not, or how good that rule is, But what I would say is basically, when we got to that Highline project, basically it was like, okay, so there was about $100 million put into it, and we're sort of early 2000s, and basically you have like the owners of this abandoned railroad. They're talking about the property owners who live along it. They sort of banded together, got together with the city commission, and they all agreed that all of a sudden they were going to rezone the whole district for arts, and also for creating a park that was going to be sort of tying together North and South Manhattan. So it has these like transportation properties to it. There's a lot of reasons why the High Line is a stellar urban planning project for many different, things that it creates for people. It's a place of refuge and all these different things. But when we sort of started to compare this project with many other comparables, and decomposing what makes it so interesting, one thing was really, there was nothing quite like it, and that was really the gardens that were on the High Line. It was like, okay, other projects have like, this beautiful LED strip lighting, or other projects have benches, other projects have coffee stands that you can go to. There's not a lot of other projects that had the whole like above the city thing going on, so that could be another independent variable that really creates a lot of value. Maybe you're getting fresh air and you're above the car, so it's something significant to note. But really it was the plants that we were like, okay, so we think we saw the variable, like it's sort of the outlier that we wanted to focus on. We looked at each other and we said, it's plants. That's where we started to get.
You saw that. We in the landscape industry, we recognize the High Line project as being an outstanding project for ecology, landscape architecture, native plants, pollinators, and biodiversity.
I don't know anything about any of this.
You're coming at it completely from the outside.
I had no idea.
You're thinking about
I'm like
technology,
the Wall Street analyst,
real estate,
tech.
You're in New York,
Yeah.
and you saw that project and your mind went to the outlier here, the defining quality is the plants.
It was, and so it was the plants, and the more you got into it, you're like, well, there's plants over there. I remember we were like, should we build a green classification system? And we started detecting like weeds on the street, and we're like, no, that's not it. It wasn't just that it was plants. And so eventually we started to dissect the sort of design. And I remember like even speaking with many architects and then even landscape architects, but I didn't get a chance to talk with many at the time. But it was mostly just architects and people in real estate development stuff. None of them had a clue. They didn't understand what was the sort of garden design. They could not describe to you today what I would describe to you as, this sort of like you said, it's a full functioning ecosystem, by P2 Dolph, and it's this sort of 500 different species, 100,000 plants that are sort of naturalistically designed. So you sort of walk into this slice of curated nature where you turn left and you turn right and you get these gorgeous, surprising sweeps of color and form, and it's a very comforting experience, and it's a very inspiring experience just to be in a Pete Udolph garden. And so eventually I was like, it's Udolph, and so it's obviously more than Udolph, but I really zeroed in on Udolph, and I remember like buying all of his books, and I even visited his private garden in the countryside of the Netherlands, in the eastern Netherlands. So we were like traveling the world. We were like, let's do something. Let's digital nomad, and so we were just nomading around the world. And I was in Amsterdam, 2 hours outside of the city, in the middle of the countryside, farms everywhere. There's nothing out there. And take a bicycle, and I had to bike 20 miles outside of the nearest train station to visit Udolph. I was hoping to meet him, and he sort of makes his backyard available to people. But really what this was for me was, this was my second Udolph garden. So, I only had the sort of sample size of one with the High Line. And, I've been reading the books, but I just remember getting there, and first of all, you see literally thousands of bees, and, it's as spectacular as you could possibly imagine, because it's sort of his personal baby, right? So, he probably takes a little bit special care of this garden versus, what's sort of in New York so far away. And it was just so beautiful. I could go on about the beauty of the garden and the ecological nature of it, but I just remember looking at the design, and sort of my goal was to sort of build AI to sort of deconstruct and understand this, and at least be able to start modeling it. I was nowhere close, by the way. And my, I know where we are today compared to where I was. I had no idea what was going on.
Yeah, it sounds like you were just developing this passion and interest for landscape design and ecology, but this was new to you.
It was completely new.
Did you have anything in your past or your background that maybe seeded that?
It's true, though, because I think there was one thing that eventually I was able to realize and tap into, and it really, you start to build your identity as you realize, wow, I'm going to dedicate my life to this, so I should probably, believe in it. And not just that, you start to tap into what really gives you these beliefs. And so I remember I was like, wait a second, like I spent most of my childhood sort of being exposed to, national parks and all of these very, very wild areas. And so I did a calculation. I was like, wow, so my parents were hippies. And my dad was, he's a very successful entrepreneur, and so is my mom, actually. But the fact is that we would go out in a hippie van for every summer, because we're from South Florida. And, here we are in Florida in the summer, and I admire everyone who's here. I'm living in California now. But my point is very simple. It's really hot. And so we eventually would get out in the summer, and we would go for 3 months at a time. And we did this 7 times. So I was like, wow, I spent like a year and a half of my life waking up in a hippie van in the middle of a forest, in the middle of mountains and by lakes, and being with people who I love, my family. They taught me love, and that was so important to make me who I am today. Deeply compassionate, to be honest. Scared and terrified and working hard on these things, but with someone who deep down really just wants to sort of give, good things to people very seriously. And so I remember just waking up and my dad sort of, putting my hand on the redwood tree and just being like, hey, this is the redwood tree,
Yeah.
And so that was really important for me to tap into. And my co-founder didn't really have that kind of an experience or that kind of background. So he never really, he would always kind of like keep the plants at the arm's length. He's like, yeah, we're studying it to make money. Mm-hmm. But I really started to buy it. I started to understand why people, value this, and what the sort of emotional experiences that actually creates the value and the sort of not just the the conscious mind of people, but also we got very interested in the sort of subconscious and physiological effects on people, and so forth. And so this sort of moves into, we go from, in the story we're now going from like 2015 2016, and you basically get to a point where we're like, okay, it's plants, we're going to go all in on understanding plants. And we start to just do our first best guess. So we built like an AI classifier for plants, which is very common now. An iNaturalist, you can just take a photo and it like, boom, it instantly classifies the plant. Back then it was not common. There was like nothing to do that. So I built a system that took 10,000 species as a data set, had 1 million images, and I trained an AI classifier that was 97% accurate on those 10,000 species. And the reason why this is significant is because we then applied to a startup incubator in Amsterdam, Netherlands, funded by a massive conglomerate of greenhouse growers of plants that exports $5 billion from 20,000 cultivars every year. And this was in 2017. And basically, we submitted our application with a very minimal web demo where you go to this web demo and it just says upload image, and you upload the image and it shows the image you uploaded, and then it shows 3 species that it classifies and the percentile likelihood of that. And we got lucky because the Monstera deliciosa was one of our plants, and the investors took a picture of the Monstera inside their space when they were testing it, and it totally nailed it. So they were like, okay, this is for real.
This works.
This works.
How many plants were you able to identify?
So it was 10,000.
10,000, okay. Yeah.
So pretty good.
So you got lucky.
Yeah, we got lucky. We got lucky. There's some bias, the statistical bias, the likelihood that it's in your data set, but we got lucky because I think sometimes it would not work. Sometimes it would work spectacularly well, but yeah, it was a hit or miss. Just if your species was in the training distribution. But the thing that was really fantastic was all of a sudden, we sort of had this crazy idea that we would build AI for the markets we didn't really know. We sort of were approaching the industry for nature through the lens that we understood, which was like a garden consumer. We didn't have any exposure to sort of the real industry, and so fortunately we started to acquire that through this program. But even that program sort of geared us towards garden retail. It was really mostly focused on how can you create new retail experiences for consumers to buy plants or understand plants and get a better plant in their backyard or in their home or something like this. It wasn't really exposing us to like, professional landscape architecture or anything like this, but it was exposing us to horticulture. So that's nice. We were starting to get some exposure to the sort of science and the industrial practices. And I got to see this place called Water Drinker. And it's this like huge facility. I mean, maybe it's as big as Cherry Lake, but it was very big, and you would see basically all of these different. It was like machines. It looked like an Amazon this is Dutch, these Dutch are really innovative.
Yeah, lots of technology
Yeah,
in
it's
ag.
really cool. And the greenhouses, these vertical greenhouses.
They're the best.
It's really super cool. So it was, you started to be like, all right, this is for real, it's going to happen. And, I think what ended up happening in that program, just to sort of take you there, to sort of give you this idea of like, okay, we're still focused on figuring out how we can create value through plants. And we're still, trying to tie it back. But I would just say that, at some point, we really wanted to like solve a problem. We're like, okay, like we're not just going to, our goal was that you would be able to push a button and get a highline. That's a direct quote from what we wanted to do. We're like, we want to push a button and get a highline. And I actually think that's still a pretty great goal. Now, that might include push a button, contract series of landscape architects and, literally an army of people to come and go ahead and make that happen. But it still might eventually be as simple with AI to create such an ecosystem that's really site appropriate and highly valued.
So you're really looking to make it easier, make it cheaper, more likely, and also ensure that the end results are more effective from an ecological standpoint.
Seriously.
To create great landscapes, great environments.
That's the reality of it. And I definitely will fortunately get past 2016, 2017 and come to where we are today, which is much more exciting, I promise you. But the answer is we effectively had that on our target, although I couldn't tell you so at the time. I would not be able to communicate what you just said to me back then. Namely, I didn't understand ecology. It wasn't something, and by the way, I don't think anyone understands ecology, but maybe you have some insight on it, but I'm just joking. I think it's a tough field. You sort of have to take physics and biology and geology and start to think about interactions of all of that, and then you get to approach ecology, and even then you're realizing it's full of uncertainty and all these things. But my simple point was that we did have the insight to sort of name our company something that was inspired by ecology, but it was also, there's this other dimension that I'll get into, which is this 3D dimension. And this turns out to be really crucial as well. And I'll sort of tell you that because it's something really key to what's happening today with some of the AI models that we're seeing, which is that 3D is a really powerful canvas through which you can start to model the physics and the sort of nature of the geometry. So for example, whether the wind is going to flow around the tree or whether the sun is going to go through the branches or through the leaves, como revi, as the Japanese would call it. But the simple point is basically, in the beginning, you need to model what's already there. You need to sort of have an idea to convert reality into a simulation space that has the sort of spatial structure of reality in a way that you can begin to run equations on top of it. And my point is that I didn't realize that at the time either, so we got really lucky on a second point. And so we named this company 3Co, and 3Co, the reason I'm sort of stepping back on it is because we had this idea that maybe the issue, we weren't really sure, maybe the issue preventing highlines from getting created was that we all can't imagine how beautiful it would be to have a highline in your backyard or whatever. And maybe this issue was sort of stemming from visualization. People just could not visualize sort of what a functioning ecosystem would look like, and therefore they would never be motivated to go for it. And so we thought, well, what if we could create a rendering engine that, would not only render the highline for you, but could sort of render the exact plant species that you could buy that could then go, basically, wherever you're looking at. And again, we were not interested, the word is not interested, just not even aware of professional practice. So we were focused on that individual sort of in their backyard who's thinking about buying a plant from one of these garden retail stores. And basically we got excited about augmented reality. So we built an augmented reality app where we 3D scanned a bunch of plant species that were being distributed by sort of our partners in Amsterdam. And these are real plants that were offered online for sale, which was pretty innovative at the time. Some of the first things I'd ever seen of a plant being shipped online. I remember seeing them put in the boxes. I'm like, yeah, I guess that works okay. You can ship a plant in a box, okay. And so we're negotiating with these Dutch people who, clearly had some sort of a distaste for Americans. and they didn't enjoy speaking English, but they could speak perfect English. And they tended to be very cold and very direct, like a New Yorker. And so, we did fine, but it wasn't. I was living across the street from the botanical garden and from the zoo, and it was just this. It was a beautiful place, but it rained all the time, and so it was just this like set of strange experiences. But we were starting a business for buying plants through the phone in augmented reality, and when you press buy, you would actually have the plant shipped to your sort of house from our partners that we had partnered with, like the shipping companies and stuff like that.
So on the phone, people could see what the plant would look like in their space, kind of like when you're shopping for furniture nowadays. You can move the couch around in your space.
Exactly that. And so, except the difference is that we had to, a lot of furniture, you have what's called a computer-aided design model, where someone has sort of put together this shape of the furniture in a 3D design platform. And so you already have the shape of the furniture. But for plants, no one, this is just nature and evolution over many years that has created these shapes. And so my point being, we had to sort of literally figure out a way to capture the 3D structure of the plant from its current reality. And so this is, gets into this field called 3D scanning is basically what it is, which I had some exposure to in a robotics lab while I was doing my master's thesis. We built a robotic system for 3D scanning plants, funded by a NASA food growing program. They wanted to grow food on Mars, and they're like, maybe if we move a robot around a plant and capture 3D models of strawberry growth, we can better sort of optimize things for, sort of developing new genes for strawberries or something like this. But that was sort of always in the back of my head, that you can sort of capture a 3D model of a plant and use that for something. So it's this sort of I'll fast forward through 3 brutal years where you basically are starting this business for augmented reality retail. You're sort of, B2B or something like this. And the point being, you realize you have this issue of taking the real world and converting it into a 3D model, particularly the complexity of plants, which it turns out are some of the most beautiful and also complicated organisms and structures we have on this planet, in terms of the diversity of them and in terms of the microscopic complexity at the geometric and of course cellular level. And so, it was sort of like biting off a much bigger problem than I had realized when we were like, we're going to get this augmented reality app and then we're going to build highlines,
Back to the highline.
And so there was this goal, but you're sort of stuck on this problem of capturing the real world. And so, fast forward you through years of studying a field that I had to become really a master in. And I'm grateful that I did, because I still use it today. But basically, it's this field called 3D computer vision, where, literally you're measuring for the camera lenses the exact shape of the lenses. And for every ray of light coming into every pixel, you're calculating the exact orientation in space, such that when multiple cameras take photos of some object, you can go ahead and then reconstruct the 3D spatial position from all of those geometric calculations in some sort of a world coordinate system is what we would call it. And so the idea being, you start to take photos of real world, you do crazy precise calculations. We're talking micrometer precise. That's how precise it has to be, because you're at the camera sensor, very, very small little things. And if you're slightly off, your model doesn't work. And your model doesn't work because your 3D model looks like trash. And so your model's working when suddenly you're seeing the most amazing simulation of reality. And so it's a very cool field in that sense, because it's a very visceral thing. You're getting good results and when you're not. And I didn't get good results for 3 years.
Yeah. Well, you're right about plants being extraordinarily complex in their forms. And, it's not a couch. It's
I kind of wish it was.
It's not a dining room table. And there's so many different plant families and plant species who have very different morphologies.
Seriously.
And it is beautiful. And there's probably a lot of mathematics encoded in the way that plants grow. But you're just trying to scan them with enough precision to where you can reconstruct them in a virtual 3D space.
Precisely.
For the purposes of modeling and allowing people to visualize these plants when they're utilized in different landscapes or spaces.
That's exactly correct. That's exactly correct. And I think eventually we realized that there was this landscape architecture market that could use this as well, for computer-aided design when they're rendering to their clients. We still didn't go all in on that, and in fact, we got a little bit distracted. I'm just going to avoid some of the sob stories and just say that I sort of eventually had to kind of my co-founder would leave the company, and the short story is that I was really motivated to pursue this. So I basically sort of reinvigorated our focus back on doing whatever it takes to get towards that highline vision. But I think what I wanted to say is that there was sort of a long period of sort of languishing in the 3D space where I'm not really doing what I wanted to set out to do, but I am learning the fundamental skills and technologies that have, at this point, I would today tell you, were absolutely essential to learn. So I don't know if there was a shortcut through all of that.
You had to go through that because it's so important. Landscapes are visual. Landscapes obviously exist in the real world, which is three-dimensional, and people want to relate to the ideas, the design concepts that are being pitched or proposed. Most people need to be able to see that in a 3D simulation.
Yeah. I think the seeing part, I still today recognize it's something that we do extremely well. So when I say we, I mean there's 3Co, and there's been a new company formed called Ecodash, and the short story of all of this is that I've still sort of taken this vision of being able to help others to see what a landscape would look like post planting. What would it look like, as Chris Hite would say, 10 years from now or 20 years from now. And those are sort of principles that come back to the core capability that I decided to focus on getting to. And so for any entrepreneur, for any young person, I could, or for anyone who wants to solve any big problem, it may take longer than you expect. It took me 4 or 6 years, something like this, just to get past that one stage. But the fact is you can do it, and then what happens is society is inventing things alongside you, and so some of the things that we use today were not invented back then. Some of the new AI models that became crucial to our ability to do that 3D reconstruction, I didn't have access to in 2018. So in 2020, a new model was invented from Google and released to everybody, open source, called neural radiance fields. Suddenly a neural network could start to think about this sort of spatial distribution of radiance or light coming out of everywhere. And I'm mentioning all of this because sometimes you have to just stick with it. There's this sort of idea that, you sort of get rich quick or sort of invent things overnight. Sometimes things happen, but the reality is if you have this big vision for sort of changing the world or doing something big, you might need to just dig in for 10 years. And
yeah, you got to grind. It takes time, even things that are much more mundane in order to launch. That startup phase is, people don't realize it takes years of just breaking even or trying not to lose too much money before you can get.
I would just say write off 10 years of your life.
Yeah. So what was the deal with your partner who dropped out? Did he lack the passion, or did he run out of time?
Well, actually, he ran out of money.
Yeah.
Just to say that I had this sort of thing where basically this is to this day has been sort of critical for my abilities to innovate. And this is something that I've disclosed a bit, but not too much, but I'm happy to talk about, which is, sort of entrepreneurs can choose to raise capital. They can choose to bootstrap. And, at some point I realized that, now it's a very different story. But back then, you're sort of doing this avant-garde, kind of very offbeat thing as far as any investor is concerned in tech. And, which is the only game in town back then. And, what I'm getting at is we just decided, okay, we'll just do this ourselves. We'll just pay, ourselves, and we'll pay for all the equipment ourselves. And for him, he had worked on Wall Street, and so he saved up quite a bit of money. But for me, I was always contracting on the side in AI. So I had this fortune of being highly skilled in the AI systems. And I wanted to say something about that sort of period of my life when I was first getting into neural networks, which is, it's meaningful because it's been a big surprise. So I didn't really know it at the time, But last year, the Nobel Prize winner in physics, his name is Geoffrey Hinton, is like this genius guru of AI. It turns out he directly advised the PhD thesis of the professor who taught me for my master's thesis in the neuroscience laboratory. And so I didn't know this at the time, and I only pieced it together years later. But my professor was like, I mean, I really hope that this is a very successful thing. And so, the founders of Google said that, like, one of the professors told them, hey, go study the World Wide Web. I think it's going to be important. You should study it. And then Larry Page famously said, that was good advice. So in my case, I was told, hey, go study Geoffrey Hinton, study everything he's ever done. And, that turned, so I think even where I'm at today, but just, the next 10 years, I think it's going to prove to be extremely sagacious, and it already has. But my point is that I got a head start on all of those techniques. So basically, the techniques that ultimately today are proving to become new ways of doing science, new ways of doing physics with much more, predictive capacities that are higher accuracy. So I think the model that I always love to come back to, just to finish this idea, is this AI model called AlphaFold. That there is a new model called Alpha Earth, by the way, which is competing with this DeepEarth model. But we're going to join forces or something. But there's this AlphaFold model that the founders of that, also from Google, won a Nobel Prize in chemistry last year
for protein folding.
For protein folding.
Yeah.
And the reason I mention it is because the sort of core techniques for beginning to take lots of these big, let's say, protein data sets, but I think of these things as just complicated data sets in general that you need to sort of build a machine for machine learning to understand it. And so my point is that the core techniques really were pioneered by Geoffrey Hinton and his sort of small group of people around him, who started to develop a branch of machine learning that only many years later did people start to realize how powerful it is. And frankly, most people, even in machine learning today, don't realize these techniques. This is sort of not your normal average build your cat or dog classifier.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a technique that we call self-supervised learning. I decided I really wanted to make sure I communicate a little bit. Our brains are actually doing this. So all the time, it turns out your brain is sort of simulating a model of what's going on across all of your senses. So an example is like, you sort of have an idea from your visual cortex, from your sort of senses of, what's underneath you, what's around you. And it's a multimodal model. And so basically you have this sort of joint understanding of all of your different senses. And I like to say, like, if you feel sort of a little tingle of sort of like light touching steps of like a very thin something on your arm, you might think that's a spider. And, suddenly your visual cortex, the spider is fired up in your mind. And the point being, suddenly all of your motor control system springs into action, right? You're like, a spider, I don't like spiders. And my point of this is to sort of take you down a path where you wouldn't have that ability unless you could literally simulate in your head the sort of what you would visually think of as a spider and all the different sort of, we actually have a part of our brain called the parietal lobe. Actually, I think it's actually on the right side of our brain, and it's for spatial sort of mapping. It's literally a 3D, has like some sort of 3D mapping to the space that we have. And so my point is that all of the different parts of our brain are together trying to reconstruct the reality. And in fact, what we're trying to do is we're trying to predict what the next sort of input across our senses are going to be. So we have this thing called, this idea that if suddenly you're surprised by something, that usually is going to take your attention, is going to sort of suddenly focus on this. And my whole point is to say that the core techniques of being able to simulate the reality in the first place is what Geoffrey Hinton was looking at. And so we call this self-supervised learning because the objective is very simple. And this is a cool thing that I get to take you down a different path, which is the objective is something that also has been proven to be probably the most obviously powerful application of AI today, which is if you come back to how ChatGPT was trained. It's the same objective. And I'm intentionally going to sort of stretch your idea of data and reality for a second. But basically, ChatGPT, or originally just GPT, generative pre-trained transformer. Big name. Really what it was, is, as you can imagine, was just completing the words in the sentences, basically. And
Predict the next word.
Predict the next word. Which is, my point is that that's actually what you're doing across all of your other senses as well. Predict the next feeling underneath your fingers as you squeeze the beautiful chair that we're on right now. You know, predict whether the plant's going to grow, right? So taking you into a space where self-supervised learning can start to encode all of the physics and all of the environmental dimensions and ecological dimensions, right? That's where we're going to go with this. But my point is that in the beginning, folks were just starting to study the human brain. They had a lot of evidence that this is true. And they started to apply it towards like images and language. And those were the two modalities that really you saw the most innovation in. And so, you know, Sam Altman in sort of 2014, 15, exposed to a lot of things as the president of Y Combinator, gets to see all these startups applying to what he's, you know, running as the best innovation program in the world. He's aware of deep learning and, you know, eventually raises this funding for this thing called OpenAI. They eventually do a lot of things, but one of the things that they did really well was complete the next word in the sentence. And I'm mentioning all of that because, of course, you know, then they do what's called fine-tuning of this model. And that's a really big idea, that you can train an AI model just to complete the word in the sentence, which I like to think of as simulating the data. It's just simulating the data. You have the raw data, you have huge paragraphs of text in the language case, and you're just building a little simulator so that you can press a button and then spit out the next word in the sentence, right? It's like sort of recreating the data set. But the point is that it's not literally a database that's saving the information. It's a compressed neural network representation, so it's much smaller. And the whole reason why I'm saying this is because it's important to say this. It's a very, very big idea, which is that, you know, once they call this pre-train a model, so it's like, it's not really your end objective, it's just the sort of pre-objective, is to create the neural network weights that basically are connecting all of the dots of the data set. Again, it can re-simulate the data. To give you an idea of how hard this is, like, you have to think about how the objective works. So you have the language, but as far as the model is concerned, it really does not know the word and the next word, right? And in fact, it might not know the next sentence or the next paragraph. And so eventually they started having it predict the whole next paragraph. And, you know, there was nothing in history, linguistic theory or anything, that was leading up to this outcome. Like, no one thought we could do this. But the neural networks, you know, sort of are what we would call a universal function approximator, which means they can basically encode any function. This is something that mathematically has been proven. And so at this point, what we are looking at, or what we sort of saw from this GPT system, is that they predict the next word. And I think everyone was like, okay, it's pretty cool. But then someone had the good idea of basically taking that system that can predict the word and take the neural network weights. And it's an important concept, so I'm going to sort of slow down on it. Basically, to really sort of take the information that's baked into the neural network and ask the neural network, okay, you can predict the next word in the sentence. Could you predict the next useful word? Which means sort of add a new constraint to the optimization. And that's pretty much the idea. But I think the core principle of having a big data set, that you first get it to just, you know, you mask, we call this masking, you mask a big part of the data set, and then you force the neural networks to recreate the statistics of whatever's been masked. It turns out when you can do that, you've built something that in the neural network itself is encoded what I like to call millions of little physics equations, or equations of reality itself. And my point of all of that is, you have in those equations the infrastructure to then do whatever you want. They're like little tools that you can then go build new things with.
But these millions of little equations, the neural network taught itself to do it in pursuit of the objective which it was given, to predict the next word or the next useful word.
Exactly.
Nobody coded those millions of equations.
No, we just very successfully coded systems that trace the sort of slight increase or decrease in optimization success from doing this, and we try. These things run, you know, these are why NVIDIA is the most valuable company in the world today.
So you think that the artificial intelligence, as you're describing it, these neural networks, is fundamentally doing something very similar to what our brains are doing.
I think that was the original inspiration and continues to be a significant source of success for AI engineers is to, I'll be honest, I think one of the things that when I was starting to look at neural networks for, basically understanding ecology, and I joke that no one understands ecology, and I'm still hopeful that maybe one day we might have really good models that can actually predict ecology, at which point I would suppose that we have some understanding, and we're not there yet. But we're getting there. We're seeing evidence. But my point is that when I really wanted to focus on that, I realized that ecology is this extremely high-dimensional, multimodal problem, is what we call it. We call it multimodal, meaning there's multiple data sets that follow different statistical distributions, but they're all actually important, or at least many of them are, for trying to understand a particular process, like let's say pollination. And it's like, how does pollination come into all of that? My simple point is that you kind of need to think about things like the amount of sunlight and all these different variables, what's under the soil, what is the species name, and you have many different types of data sets that I like to say give you different lenses into the underlying physical reality that's outside. You have all these different sensors and people might measure different things, but in fact it's clues to the underlying physical reality.
Right.
And so I started to realize, like, if you take a system that can basically learn to reconstruct those different data sets, you might have in those equations that are learned something even more fundamental in terms of the sort of how these different things interact physically, because the idea is that it would not be able to predict sort of the masking of these data sets unless it truly understood the generative physical relationships. And so where I'm going with that is I was trying to solve this problem, as I told you, we were talking a little bit before. I just wanted to solve the question of pollination so I can create great pollinator gardens. That's something that I've been focused on recently, and I'll cover the in-between part of the history back then if we get to it. But this is more interesting. And to say that I really just wanted to solve this problem of, okay, on June 2nd of 2029, let's say at this site right out here, this GPS coordinate, for that particular species of plant, is it flowering? And second of all, is the state's butterfly, is that going to visit it on that day? And is it going to pollinate it? And so this is this hard problem of predicting that question, and I really didn't have a good insight into how I would go about that. And it turns out there wasn't any off-the-shelf model or deep learning model or anything like this to solve that problem. And I'll talk about how I solved it, but I just want to kind of tell you that in attacking that problem, I actually, to just bring us back to the neuroscience thing for a second, I was pulling from some of the computational cognitive neuroscience theory that was taught to me while I was in that lab, and it was basically that we are sort of, the word is called induction. So basically, I mentioned the whole spider on your arm, or the much nicer example is you close your eyes and I put a flower in front of your nose, and maybe it's a beautiful smelling rose, and you can smell that rose, and you'll be able to visualize the rose, and you can imagine the spatial structure of the rose, and you can even maybe feel the petals of the rose. And so these are different sensors, sensory models that are being ignited by just a word to the wise. So we sort of have this property in our intelligence that a small piece of information in one of our sensory modalities instantly gives us a complete model of all of the other modalities. And so I remember reaching out to my neuroscience colleagues, and I was like, hey, do you know anything about this? They're like, no. I was like, okay, fine. But the point is that basically...
You call this induction?
It is called induction.
Yeah.
It's considered inference with only a little evidence, basically.
So is this if you have a smell or a scent that takes you back and it brings to the fore memories of...
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's connected to all of these other images and thoughts.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the idea is, can you have a complete model of the universe with only a hint?
Mm-hmm.
And and then you start to get into some other people have studied this idea of is it computable, is the data information, do you have the data to solve this problem, etc. But my perspective is could you predict what the ecosystem is going to do given sparse information that you may have on your site and sparse information that we may have collected in literature to date across different plant species and so forth? Could you fill in the rest of the gaps? That was the big idea. And so could you, we sort of have these like matrices of plant traits and so forth, could all these missing information, can you get an AI to fill in the rest of the gaps? So eventually I'm really looking for, how to do this, because if I'm to try to cover some of that past history real quick, I basically in 2023 was very fortunate to have some people at the University of Florida who liked me, I guess, and I had a presidential scholarship while I was there, and they're like, whoa, what you're doing with RECO is incredible. You should meet everyone in IFAS, and you should meet all the people in the School of Agriculture to basically help them with what you're doing. And I was like, okay, sure. And I meet with a bunch of professors and like deans and things like this. And one guy in particular named Howard Beck, Professor Howard Beck, was like, it was like a shock that there was another human on this universe who was sort of thinking in the same space as me. He was thinking about augmented reality, he was thinking about, large models and all these different things. And so it was great collaborating with him to sort of even understand some of these fields, because he was a professor at UF previously in biological and agricultural engineering. So he like really had been doing this stuff for a long time, databases, expert systems, recommender systems, all these kinds of things. But the point is that he was totally sold on neural networks, and then I sort of had the neural network background to actually attack the problem. So together we were just exploring things, but we ended up hosting like workshops and things like this that would attract other professors who eventually would also advise everything that we're doing. And I just remember at some point, like I'm dealing with like Gail Hansen, who's like, she's a dynamo, a force of nature, sort of in the landscape architecture field, but she's actually really coming at it from environmental horticulture and sort of how can we create landscapes that are actually servicing our environments. I remember she walks into a workshop that I was hosting, and she walks in and very loudly declares, she's like, I don't know about all this AI stuff, but I'm here, and I'm like, okay. So, we had all the right collaborators in the room, I think, to be exposed to the correct ideas and be really pushed in the right direction. It's because of these people that I even started to work on native plants, that I even started to pay attention to ecology. So right away I give credit to all of the scientists and people who've been trying to solve these problems for a long time. The movement that they've been building, I'm just continuing to pick up the torch and take it, honestly. So I don't really take credit intellectually for going in the direction that I went. I think they were like, look, you need to go in this direction. So, the ecological dimension sort of was handed to me. And eventually, though, I started to sort of think a little bit for myself about the ecosystems and understand just how powerful and just how important they are. And, if I'm to just take you on one more kind of connection there, the thing that really brought me all the way back to the push a button, get a high line, like we're on track, is one conversation that I love to recount with Thomas Rayner and the landscape architect.
Planting in a post-wild world.
Yeah. Fantastic human being, great, brilliant designer, great educator, someone who really cares to share to the next generation, who also, compared to all of the other books that I read, including from Pete Udolph and all these other people, really actually started to try to decompose and dissect and explain in sort of formulas and frameworks that are actually implementable, how to even think about creating these kinds of naturalistic gardens and designs and ecosystems that are also beautiful and sort of solving the landscape's needs and things like this. So eventually, with Chris Height also took a great interest in me early on. So I sort of became Chris's project, and Cody Smith and all these guys at Dix.Height Partners. And, some of these landscape architects started to recognize, wow, what you're doing with AI could really have a big impact on the industry and service the industry very effectively. So they were very gracious, and still are to this day, to sort of work with me on making sure I'm plugged into the landscape architecture industry and that we're building products that are ultimately going to have, I hope and believe, a very big positive effect on that industry, and we'll talk about that. But where I'm really going with all of this is just basically that, there was this real focus and intent on basically getting to the point where, we can actually model these problems and actually, create AI to sort of, really accelerate and scale and automate some of the hardest scientific challenges that they're facing today. So I figure I'll kind of stop for a second.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm just listening because I'm really interested in what you're saying. I'm learning a lot about artificial intelligence and neural networks. But the reason you're here is because you're trying to connect those technologies to ecology and landscape, and that's something we'll discuss more. But what I'm hearing you say is that ecology is so complex, and really no one fully understands it because there are so many variables, and you call it multimodal, but there's so many different things that are going on in an ecosystem, that some of which we can observe and measure, and some of it has been documented, but much of which is still beyond our understanding. I mean, I was talking to an agronomist just the other day on this podcast, and he's really fascinated with what's going on at the microscopic level within 2 to 3 millimeters from the root hair, and there's these gradients of pH that are being shaped by the interaction of aluminum and hydrogen, and how ions are kicking off, whenever you have a release of various elements in that space. So, but that then drives, because it changes the pH and it changes the availability of nutrients, it drives the ability of the plant to uptake certain minerals and nutrients, and drives the plant's performance, which we know then drives the activity of pollinators at a higher trophic level.
Wow.
And yet you wouldn't. How do you model all of that?
Yeah.
How do you understand what's going on in the soil, what's going on at the chemical molecular level, what's going on with all of these different life cycles? As you were asking about the state butterfly, will it be there at this particular date? Well, was the host plant there where it would lay its eggs and where it build its cocoon, and
Right.
How much distance can it travel, and what else do we not know about these pollinators and their life cycles and their biology? So yeah, I understand it's incredibly complex. You're suggesting that maybe through induction, an artificial intelligence system can piece it together if it has enough foundational data.
That's correct. Yeah, and I'm going to respond directly to that. I did want to say one thing that I meant to lead us down the Thomas Rayner and say one thing. I'm going to respond to what you're getting with the induction. Rayner, what he told me, which was a big thing, was that he believes, we were talking about Pete Udolph's gardens and, why they're so beautiful. And he said to me, Udolph's artistry is profound. So, right away, it's a work of art. But he believes that the greatest source of beauty in those gardens is the ecological function.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just kind of wanted to establish that because, in the history of sort of tying together, how do you create value for people? How do you ultimately sort of optimize that creation of what people would perceive to be maybe functional spaces as much as beautiful? It doesn't have to be a beautiful space to be a higher valued space, but beauty is a good one to follow, it turns out. And so when Rayner told me it was ecological function,
Mm-hmm.
I very much sort of stopped everything else that I was doing and was like, let's go optimize ecological function. And so just to establish that, sort of point where, I have sort of, it's no longer, hey, I'm modeling plants or it's like I need to model the sort of ecosystem services. And so I wanted to kind of give you that sort of capstone of where that lands 2024 sometime. And then, indeed motivated to solve the question of like modeling pollination, modeling some of these ecosystem services that we know are sort of widely underrated of what they do for all of agriculture and, all of plant reproduction, and, plants are growing more vigorously when they're pollinated. And so you get all these major unexpected benefits, like $500 billion per year in the pockets of farmers everywhere and nursery owners because of more pollination occurring, particularly for those who are growing vegetables and fruits and these types of things. So I was like, okay, I'm all in. Like, let's solve this problem. Like, let's solve the problem of how you're going to build AI to do it. And so that sort of summarizes my whole story right there to bring you to where we are today, which is very exciting.
Yeah. So
And
from planetary physics at NASA to
yeah,
wanting to optimize for ecological function.
that's right.
And you're right. I think it is ecological function that ultimately attracts people to a landscape.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it is beautiful in a way that cannot be really put into words. And it's not just because it's colorful. It's not just because it has harmony and balance and forms and structure and things like that
Right.
people might think about in terms of.
Seems like it's an instinct, right? Like it's some sort of evolved
I think it's an
instinct.
instinct. Yeah, I think there's a word for it, biophilia.
Yeah.
The love of nature. And when you think about the most valued and prized spaces, outdoor spaces, are the wild ones. It's like you were saying about your experiences as a child going to the national parks. Those are the places that people probably would list first in terms of the most amazing places on earth, where they feel the most awe and the most inspiration.
We had this experiment which was like to ask people, what's your paradise? And some people would be like, I remember asking a guy from Hong Kong, and he lived in like a small space, and he's like, a big mattress. And so like not everyone follows this path, but a surprising number of people,
A large number of people.
start describing, flourishing as a landscape. They're sort of describing a beautiful, attractive nature through which they feel like is, I think we talk about like resourceful or,
Well, you have, in a flourishing ecosystem, you have all of the signs
Right.
of health.
Yeah.
And all of the indications that you will find ample resources for your own survival and thriving.
And this all happens probably in the span of, milliseconds that you're making this
Like
interpretation.
we evolved to identify healthy and resourceful environments because I think, in our hunter-gatherer days, we needed to be quick.
Yeah.
To evaluate and assess the territory.
In my mind, so starting to trace all this together, and then, in my mind, it's one of the greatest miracles that we have this instinct. It's tied to how we value spaces. You can increase the value of land by increasing the functionality of the ecosystem, and you'll be simultaneously addressing and supporting solutions to really what are truly some of our greatest environmental catastrophes and problems of our generation. Biodiversity loss, habitat loss, you go down a long, long list. And, it turns out that you can sort of, by creating a healthy, functioning ecosystem, you can sort of do this sort of like, pro bono activity for everyone, and for literally not just for humans, but for the hummingbird. You start to get, I remember getting this idea that we should create AI agents that are literally just representing wildlife, and humans might be like trying to negotiate with the AI agents for wildlife, but the point is really to sort of say like they deserve agency too. I mean, certainly we are very selfish creatures, we're predators, we're dominant, we own the earth, but in reality, we're so powerful, and also there's such a tragedy of the commons that it's vital that those of us who sort of, believed in like protecting mere woods in California, this will be past generations, those of us in the future, we can basically, I realize, encode and enforce in the law that we, cultivate ecosystems and protect ecosystems, and it's for the benefit of everybody.
Well, I think that's where we're heading, and that's inevitably what we will do, because if we don't, we're going to face such dire consequences.
They call it tipping points of sort of catastrophe.
Yes, and it all comes down to ecological function, which perhaps is at the heart of what people value in nature and what people identify as beautiful and valuable in a landscape. And all of these ecosystem services are ultimately incredibly enriching to so many people.
Yeah, financially, economically.
Yes, yet it is the ultimate economic externality. I mean, that is, I think, the poster child for an externality. We do not take into account the value or the cost of ecosystem services.
That's right. So one of the things that I'll say, because it's been influential and encouraging, inspiring, and sort of, something that made me feel a little bit less crazy, is seeing some of the research coming out of, I think starting at least from Stanford University, where I've been hanging out and just walking around campus and meeting with researchers. And I'll just sort of, say that basically one of the professors there, her name is Gretchen Daly, and she had this idea of even thinking about ecosystem services in the early 2000s. She's not the first, but she really, I think, popularized these terms. And basically, she ended up going on to have a stellar career where she effectively started creating computational models of all these ecosystem services. And she called it the Natural Capital Project. Have you heard of this before?
No, it's fascinating.
Really interesting because not only did the project sort of successfully build, I'm looking at the models and I'm like, I'm sort of have this like elitist view of modeling where I'm like, oh, those differential equations are like loaded with inaccuracy, But the reality is that it's incredible that she did what she did. I'm sure it's approximately not orders of magnitude wrong. And the most important thing is that it actually got plugged into many countries, sort of at the very top. So when you're talking about land use management for the president of the Bahamas or for the president of, Venezuela or whatever, like, they're actually implementing her computational models
to quantify or
pollination services,
monetize
ecosystem benefits.
Yeah.
It's incredible. So you're actually starting to see, because I think they called it...
was she involved with the I4 model for quantifying the value of forest to cities?
I mean, it could be connected. One word that came to mind was not calling it gross domestic product, but gross ecological product or gross ecosystem product or something like this. The point being, they started, to quantify the forests and many other things. And the point being, they were like, look, here's your GDP, here's your here's your ecological, financial value. And so if you're running your country, you might want to consider optimizing this.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, and I think we need to move in that direction and start to help people connect the value of these functioning ecosystems.
It feels like we're in the Stone Ages compared to where that's going. I mean, you start to see projects that she's successful with, and she's not the only one, but it's very encouraging to see a group of policymakers who are actually trying to do good policy, first of all. But second of all, I'm not so cynical. I just think it's not everyone is sort of actually motivated by that. But then once you sort of get these people and they're paying attention to these models, let's say they're paying attention to the value of the native ecosystems, and they're paying attention, let's say, in Central Florida or, across the state of Florida. I think what you can start to argue is that you can literally, lift up all Floridians, by doing what we're doing here. I think that's basically the end game, because you start to, get these systems that can make it more likely that the plants will grow, more likely that they'll flower, because you're putting the right plant in the right place, as IFAS likes to say, and so forth. And you go down the long list of things that you would want to do that optimization. But the point is that, you expect that every one of your farms is producing more. You expect that you're going to have, more wood in reserve or whatever. There's literally like hundreds of ecosystem services. It's like a huge long list of things.
Yeah, I don't know if we should talk more about it to help people understand. Yeah. No, I'm just asking because do people fully appreciate the depth and extent of which we rely on high functioning ecosystems in order to support our lives and our economies? We need to talk about it.
I think this is why your podcast is, sort of a very nice step in the right direction, why the work that you do through the Outside Collaborative is, the future. And I would say, for everyone a part of that, I think of it as like it's just starting to try to reverse the trend. But my point is that I sort of joke, no one understands ecology. I think Gretchen Daly understands a little bit of ecology and, building computational models to sort of demonstrate it. And my point is like, but it's sort of, like I would just say, it brings me back when I get really depressed. I'm like, well, what can I do about it? And, I know that I can start a company that can start to basically create more value for my clients and for my partners. So right away, put more money in the pockets of the landscape architects, the nursery owners, the real estate developers, okay? But then also simultaneously, because there's this beautiful connection between, creating value in the land and, let's say, creating values through tools that are provided to these different industries and stakeholders that bring them together, simultaneously, optimizing the different ecosystem services so that sort of automatically, when a landscape architect sets out to create a landscape, automatically they're not sort of going too far, or at least if they are, it's like warning, like that is not an ecosystem, And I was joking with my director of art, who's, she creates these like beautiful pictures, and we just sort of jam out in like fun ways to communicate to people. And we were like, well, what if, you're creating a design and then we somehow, try to like give you this vacuous feeling in the design platform that there are no butterflies there. There's none.
Yeah.
And so this idea that you're trying to lead people towards the smarter outcome, but what we realized is that we need to first of all build a creative tool for the industry. People are not gonna follow our direction. If we say, hey, you have to put this plant there, people are like, why? The best thing we can try to do is to try to motivate them to have the value that they could have, and then really to give them the chance to sort of simulate any type of scenario they want. Eventually I realized the sort of superpower that we have is that we can create, with all of the best scientists working with me, who I would right away point to a lot of folks who deserve credit. And I'm excited. Last week I worked with 5 PhD students in GeoAI and had just the most thrilling week of creating AI for wildfire prediction, and ultimately for getting back to this point where a sort of environmental manager or landscape designer can choose plants that are more ecologically resilient. Wildfire being one thing in the Western United States that's a really big deal and a really big problem. And just basically kind of tracing all of this back, what I realized is that with 5 PhD students in 1 week, we literally had like at least 2 spectacular inventions, breakthroughs for AI. And I'm only saying this because I'm like, wow, what if I had like 200 PhD students working with me, and we were all focused on solving ecological problems and supporting the industries? Like, maybe we could really have the impact that we're talking about.
Yeah, of course, yeah. The tools that you're working with are incredibly powerful, as I think many people now understand. Not just the neural networks and the machine learning and the AI, but as you explained, you sacrificed 3 or 4 years of your life mastering 3D modeling, and which I think that's the power of combining the two. To have the AI help us make better decisions, and have the 3D models help us to visualize and understand what those decisions are going to look like.
I mean, to build with you right now, because you totally see it, because it's probably the most exciting thing, and I have to use both my hands here. So the most exciting thing, I wanted to say something, but I'm like, no, that hasn't been publicly disclosed yet. But the most exciting thing is that basically we are starting to see what we call the convergence of different fields. And so as a sort of simple idea, this idea of having a photorealistic 3D model of your site, so it's this 3D digital twin is what we call that. But then additionally, having an ecosystem sort of scientific simulation that is literally baked into the fabric of that 3D model. So, and additionally, not just having the 3D model of a site, which at this point we've got a great service that we're shortly launching across Central Florida in the United States, actually, for flying drones around, different landscape sites, and ultimately, creating these 3D models with all that photography. But my whole point is that we also collect, soil samples, send it to the lab. This is from Chris Height. She's like, yeah, here's how you dig up the soil. I'm like, oh, cool. You send it to that lab. I'm like, oh, great. And then I'm like talking with the UF professors running the chemistry tests. And my whole point is that you get this sort of overlay of the 3D model and, let's say, the soil properties, and, an overlay of the 3D model and, let's say, where the sun is going to be all year round, all the different angles, calculate the amount of radiance received right there at that microclimate, and get the exact shape and structure and amount of intensity of light, so that way you can calculate with sort of really much higher precision than has ever been calculated before the exact, whether a plant species would be just totally in its element at that exact place.
Mm-hmm. So you're trying to recommend plant species that are most likely to thrive and be adapted to the specific conditions of that site and
increase the palette, because it's one thing to say there's one plant species. There are usually several.
Sure.
But what we've recognized is that the palette of most designers is quite limited. It's normal. It takes a very strange person like Pete Udolph to pursue a palette with 1,000 plant species in it.
Right.
It's very abnormal.
But yet, I think that's going to be the key to high-functioning ecosystems because, not knowing everything there is to know about ecosystems, you can identify a few principles that seem to be present in high-functioning ecosystems. Biodiversity has got to be at the top of that list.
100%.
The more species you have, then the more interactions you have, the more complexity you have, and the more resilience and adaptability. So,
Right.
I'm
it makes sense.
Yeah, I'm a huge advocate for using more diversity in design, and it's also kind of a security against mistakes that you can make because you might not predict everything correctly, and you might plant a plant or two or species or two that ultimately were not the best selections for that site. But because you have a high amount of diversity, then you've really mitigated that risk. And you've created synergies in that landscape ecologically that probably are impossible for anyone or anything to predict.
No, it's closer to what nature does. I mean, on some level, I do think there's sort of environmental restoration, like, hey, let's just recreate the habitat exactly as it was, which I think is a fine field, and I think we should preserve and restore many environments. But at the other level, I realize, landscape architecture is often creating these sort of augmented landscapes, and, you're augmenting, it's going to produce food. It's going to resist stormwater. It's going to resist extreme heat in the hot summers of Florida. So we all don't have to go on vacation. We can just stay here under the shade. And the point being, eventually what I started to realize about all of what you're talking about is that I sort of started to see this is what we would call an AI, a multi-objective optimization problem, which is a simple thing to say, but the cool thing, like when I talk to my AI colleagues about this, I'm like, guys, like we do this all the time. You have you need to maximize this, minimize that, and what we do is we sort of make sure that we can measure it, first of all. So you have some sort of maybe model of how you can measure something. Is it receiving, is this plant actually providing, shade in the hot summer? How much? And so you have you have to have a model of it. And like I said, is the plant going to be pollinating that particular species of butterfly? What about all of the species of butterflies? What about all of the species of bees? What about all of the species of birds? What is the distribution of benefit for them, and how much benefit per each? So you start to calculate these things. And by the way, we don't know the answer to most of these questions, but we have a lot of information. So we talked about the induction capacities, which we'll have to come back to. But I think basically the whole big idea is simply that could we start to piece together all of a model of these different ecosystem services with that precision, such that when you're exploring not just the sort of ecological viability of whether a plant species would be thriving, but also addressing your other design objectives, and you're looking at metrics of these design objectives, here's the thing. I wouldn't even ask you to try to think about solving that problem, because it's basically impossible for a human to sort of go through this high dimensional design space and do a very good job with it. Yeah, you can be shown a lot of metrics and come up with something nice, but my point is that there is sort of an optimization where you can actually sort of, I don't want to say guarantee, but you can make it very likely that you get like this optimal outcome for whatever your weighting is of these different priorities.
You can make any design better with artificial intelligence.
Probably.
If that artificial intelligence is properly trained and has I guess the right data.
It's just really good at crunching all these numbers.
Yeah, I mean, look, I like to think that I'm a smart person who brings a lot of value to the world, but I use AI every day because it just makes me better.
Yeah, exactly.
It just makes me better, and now, of course, I feel like I'm still in control and with the objective and asking the questions.
Yeah,
and
the robots aren't marching in the streets yet.
Yeah, but we can all benefit from this. So why wouldn't everything that we're talking about, an ecological AI that has the ability to make great recommendations based on the best available data in the world on ecology and plant science, why wouldn't that just come out of something like OpenAI and ChatGPT? Why does
That's a great question.
Someone like you need to develop a specific AI?
That's a great question, actually. It's something that I'll try to answer this clearly. I think that there is a cultural blindness for most sort of, let's say computer scientists and, all kinds of, engineers and folks who would be capable of pursuing this, but they generally, by and large, sort of resist this entropy of, trying to understand these very hard, complicated problems. So they're sort of like trying to solve the problem of building the chatbot, and they're trying to create a system that can generate images, and they're thinking about all kinds of random things. And you're sort of building amazing systems. These guys are, I use these tools every day as well. I use them to code, and some of these people are now creating tools that are creating more efficient coding, and the coding is coding itself, and you're getting what we call this sort of recursive intelligence explosion. It's happening now. It's happening. I mean, I've watched as my AI capabilities have accelerated by 10x, over the past year. So this is real. But I think what's and I tell the AI, hey, go ahead and create this machine that can do something. It literally designs the whole thing. It's like just engineered my Ferrari. But my point, which is, sort of critical, is that I find that like most of these people solving those problems, they know very little and have very little appreciation for the physical fabric of reality.
The natural world.
Yeah, like it's a bit shocking. And so this is where I get to be like, well, why do I have anything there? And I'm like, well, I did study physics. And so it was like my sort of NASA planetary physics background that grounded me in this field of the natural sciences first and foremost as my view of the world. And everything that I did through AI was sort of, thinking about AI as a means to engage with the physical world. And so I'm saying this because that's not the path that most of these AI engineers took. It's not the path of Sam Altman. Sam Altman says, I look forward to the day when someone invents some new AI for physics. And I'm thinking, oh, I did it.
Yeah.
But,
so I guess all of the investment and the development in the space of AI has been focused on more on different issues.
It's different issues. I don't want to mischaracterize it. I would just say that's the dominant philosophy that I just described. Like there's definitely folks in robotics. There are, AI for nature, sort of pioneers out there. Jeff Bezos had this great sort of innovation program, which I'm grateful to have been a reviewer of these proposals, and basically, really sort of like celebrating and supporting all of the people who are trying to solve these problems through AI. There are many of them. So I don't want to characterize it as like they're not out there. It's just that the relative percentile of these people versus mountains of people who want to go build another LLM.
Yeah.
It's like shocking to me.
So yeah, predict the next word and build another GPT model is really looking at human knowledge, the human experience, mostly through the written word. And that's kind of, that's a little bit, a few steps removed from the natural world.
That's right. So there is one AI person who I really like a lot. He's sort of in between. He's sort of a pioneer of the vision. And so he would say, hey, vision, we're mostly doing vision, not language in our heads, is what he would say. And basically, so he created a model that he's calling a world model that's predicting the next frame in a video. And I'm mentioning it because we're using this in DeepEarth, actually, to take in all of the different visual and geospatial data sets. We're feeding it into this model from Meta, and it's called VJEPA2. It has a strange name, but that's the name of the model. And basically, it's an open source model that was trained on 1 million hours of video captured from YouTube that they predict the next frame in the video. And they hold out parts of the video. They literally cover up parts of the video, and it's generating the video. And yeah, we found that it has spectacular intelligence of plants.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we're getting beyond words, and now we're actually looking at the real world where maybe the AI can observe the plants.
What's interesting to me is that they build this model and they release it, and then as far as I can tell, there's different research groups, so it's not like no one's there doing this, but these are their sort of flagship efforts. Let's say at Meta, Zuckerberg's famously offering the top AI engineers $100 million just to jump ship and come tell me all the secrets of your company, and we'll fund it at Meta and blah blah blah. And my point is that It's interesting to me that when I sort of, very happily disclose for this open source model, what is sort of the key innovation that I think is going to be really impactful, and we just got proof of it last week. So it's a big deal. The National Science Foundation funded us, I mentioned, to go do wildfire AI prediction. I had a brilliant group of PhD students, and one of them, I gave her a project that I thought was going to fail. I was like, I'll give this guy a very easy project, we'll have some results. I don't want to say it was easy, but it was just like the sort of more straightforward one. It was the most logical path to getting a good result. We have some results guaranteed, and I'll take a hugely risky research portfolio with my 5 students, and one person goes for this practically impossible problem of adapting a 3D reconstruction system from the literature of the 3D modeling, where you get that photorealistic 3D model, and putting it to ecological data sets. And so this was a technique that I pinpointed. Once I started to think about how to solve this pollination prediction problem, it came back to this very fundamental question of how do you sort of get all these different data sets to talk to each other? What is it that actually unifies these data sets? And it turns out that they all exist in some sort of coordinate system of space on this planet, typically. And then in some sort of another 4th dimension. So you think of space as a 3D position on the planet, X, Y, Z. I have a XYZ tattoo on my arm. I'll spare the camera. But basically, you have XYZ, and then you also have this axis of time going forward. So XYZT, and there's this interesting question of, can you take every piece of data that you've ever sort of collected on the ecosystems, and of course much more, but ecosystems being a big enough focus, and can you put an XYZT coordinate on it? On this planet, it happened June 2nd at 2 p.m., and sort of that's the timestamp. It happened at this latitude, longitude, at this elevation or this depth. And, so it turns out, I know this from the sort of, I mentioned like the 3D modeling thing proved to be extremely lucky. It is. Because it turned out the techniques from 3D modeling that I learned over the years of doing this the hard way, just getting these photorealistic 3D models of plants, it turns out you have to sort of feed the neural network a much richer understanding of space and time. Focus on space for a second, ignore time. You have to sort of take a 3D coordinate, and then you have to blow it up and tell the neural network all kinds of things about this 3D coordinate. It's going to be really hard to communicate to non-technical audiences what I mean, because it's a technique that is sort of involves taking a piece of information and then literally expanding its dimensionality. It's not a normal thing. It's called hashing, and sort of it just turns out that when you do this, suddenly the neural networks went from getting these fuzzy reconstructions, really fuzzy looking 3D models of space, to crystal clear, sharp reconstructions. And the reason was because it allowed the neural network to sort of look more deeply into the nooks and crannies of space, which is a very fundamental thing. We don't really think of space this way. We think of space as just empty space. But what we're really talking about is a coordinate system. And so it allowed the neural network, they wrote in their paper for neural radiance fields, to learn high frequency details of space. So when you have a lot of information in a small period of space, you can give the neural network a lot of structure to sort of think about. It's the best way I could tell you. But what I would say to you is that eventually over the coming years, what ended up happening is NVIDIA then picked up this technique and created a model that's actually important to mention because it's, again, fundamental to this new AI model called DeepEarth, which I'm extremely excited about. And I'll just say that in the NVIDIA technique, the reason why it's so profound is because you have this technique that they call multi-resolution, so let's say multiple scales of space, hash encoding, and that was the thing that I just mentioned to you, this sort of expanding of the hash dimensions. And basically all I'm getting at is that what you end up being able to tell the neural network is how to sort of build a deep sort of basically set of neural network weights. So we talked about how you encode the reality into a smaller set of weights, basically, and you have all the different synaptic connections of the brain, for example. But in the case of dealing with space, what the NVIDIA team found was that you can sort of teach the neural network to think about large areas of space and have, let's say, the simplest example would be if you're trying to create a 3D model of, let's say, the landscape outside, and you literally have, 100 meters by 100 meters by 100 meters, so a 3D space of that dimensionality, what they found was that you can sort of have part of your neural network to focus on 10 by 10 meters, and then another part to focus on 1 by 1, and another part to focus on 0.1 by 0.1, and another part to focus on 0.01. And in theory, you could keep going. You can go in either direction. And so
you're compartmentalizing the neural network to look at different scales and magnitudes?
Which it turns out, I mentioned this to one of my brilliant AI colleagues who worked at Google DeepMind, which was acquired by Google for $500 million. I got to see him last week. And basically, he told me when I mentioned this to him that that's what the human brain's doing as well. Basically, we actually think of scales differently. We have different parts of our brain. But also I wanted to say this because it might be a little bit simpler. That's, of course, what the sort of number system that we use does. The number system has sort of different units for orders of magnitude of space, basically. Or, obviously numbers do a lot of things just beyond focusing on spatial information. But that's the point of it, is that you sort of have different, let's say the different units of your number system. You have a different, let's say, neural network that focuses on each of those different things. And so one of the neural network's job is just to reconstruct the high detail. But the reason why this is fascinating is because, if you take that model and you start to apply it to, let's say, the planet, what you can actually do is you can actually start to get, let's say, large-scale climate effects encoded by, neural networks that are thinking about, let's say, 100 by 100 kilometers, because we're American, but we're scientists, so we got to use the metric system. But basically, 100 by 100 kilometers. And, there's a neural network that's job is really just to think about phenomena that are best represented at that scale. Mm-hmm. And then you go all the way down to microscopic. I mean, I literally think you could have something that is, simultaneously having a neural representation of cellular phenomena. We're not there yet, but this is the theory. And also of the climate. And then putting these weights into sort of a combined representation. This is all already solved, this sort of integration of the multiple scales and then the hash encoding at multiple scales. And NVIDIA demonstrated this with a profound effect where all of a sudden they're showing these like photorealistic 3D models of like a laboratory scientist in some NVIDIA really cool robotics lab, and suddenly the camera's like flying around, or they're like flying around their campus from a drone survey, but then they're using their multi-resolution hash encoding to show that like the camera comes all the way up to the close-up detail and it flies around, and they're like, look, we've encoded the whole thing. Mm-hmm. They're like, we can simulate the whole thing. And that's just what we would call light or radiance. So there was no ecology in that. But my whole point is that I had this sort of thesis that what if you could take that technique and encode the ecological effects. I have to give AI credit for helping me. You mentioned AI as your collaborator. It's me too, and so is everybody. But my point is that I remember asking the AI system, I was like, what do you think that this will work? Like, what's going to happen if we try this? And it was like, yeah, you'll get sort of, the different ecological phenomena will get encoded at the different scales, and they'll all have their neural network weights. And basically you'll be able to, first of all, reconstruct the raw data sets. And I mentioned this sort of space and time fabric, because that's what we started talking about, was mostly space. All we talked about there was space. I'll just, without getting into technical detail, say one thing about time. This is strange that we're talking about space and time. And the fact is that I'm sort of most inspired by my exposure in physics and astrophysics, modern physics class at University of Florida, studying Einstein's equations. It's always cool when you get to just drop Einstein. But the fact is, it was something that really stuck out for me here, because basically, it was very clear. Einstein was very clear that it was really hard to basically solve the mathematics of getting relativity, general relativity and special relativity, which involved, he said, the only way he could do it is to stop thinking about time as sort of this independent variable and to start thinking about time and space as being what like Carl Sagan or one of these great educators might call a fabric. Mm-hmm. And you always see this like video and these beautiful animations of like the black hole being like warping of time and space, and there's like a ball rolling, and it doesn't make any sense for a lot of people, but it's like sort of, that's like what you think. And I remember thinking, when I'm sort of sitting here getting ready to encode all these different phenomena and coming up with the right tool to do that, thinking, well, let's not violate Einstein's laws. Like they've been proven to be true, and it required space and time to be treated together. And so I said to myself, well, I'm just going to make sure that the neural network sort of can see the interrelationships between spatial dimensions and what turns out to be a transformation of spatial dimensions, meaning time is sort of, take the spatial location of my hand, time is a transformation of my hand, and this is true for a lot of things.
It's motion. Space and time as a fabric is motion.
Process of physics or whatever you want to call it, but it's still basically this fabric of space and time are really intimately tied together. This time is not some independent variable, basically.
So what does this have to do with creating an ecological AI?
Yeah, so this is key because this is the innovation. Once you basically get to the point of, thinking about, okay, let's put all of this into the AI system, what you can do is you can put this 4D XYZT coordinate on every single data set that you have. And then when you're training the neural network, you can tell it, hey, at this particular location in time, you get to observe, let's say these 10 different variables that we have data for. And these other 50 variables, we've never measured it there. We don't have any data for it. So you're just going to mask it. And, we talked about this induction. We'll come back to it again and again, because the idea is that basically if the neural network can actually start to see that what unifies those data sets at this particular place, at this particular time, is the coordinate itself. And like I said, I use the word hash, if you can start to show the neural network much more things, much more structure of that location and moment in time, then it turns out that basically its ability to reconstruct what is actually there across your different variables is sort of much more greatly enhanced. And so what I just wanted to say was that last week we had a state-of-the-art breakthrough result where we ran this model called Grid 4D, which is this XYZT encoder that I described, and ran it on predicting live fuel moisture content. It's technical scientific property of how much water is inside the plants, basically, and that predicts whether it's going to resist fire. And we had a data set of like 100,000 observations across the United States over 6 years. And actually, there was no other variable that was most predictive with our neural network than space and time itself with Grid 4D. It totally crushed all of the other modalities, meaning all the model really needed was to sort of know exactly where it was in space and time. But classically, if you try to put those variables into a regression system, you don't perform very well. I mean, it's not a very obvious sort of connection between the two. This Grid 4D is the fabric, the sort of deep neural network manifold that puts in space and time and outputs. I mean, you can train it basically to output in that case, fire distribution. But when I saw the results, I first of all couldn't believe it because I was like...
So you're able to predict moisture content in plants based on its location.
And what I'm claiming right now is that we'll be able to predict all of the ecological variables with this technique.
Mm-hmm. And so is it looking at pictures? Is it looking at video? Or
it could be all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we also simultaneously, another project had a student deal with pictures basically, and she was extracting from satellite and aerial imagery, I was telling you that one of the AI engineers was sort of like a vision guy, and he sort of focuses on dealing with imagery basically and turning it, classically a deep neural network could say it's a cat or a dog or it's this species or that species. But it turns out that there's an intermediate layer there where if you can extract the deep visual structure without doing classification, literally just extract it and put masks over it and then reconstruct the image itself it was originally had a big part of the image was missing, the neural network didn't get to see it, but you forced it to perform induction on that image of what's missing in the image. You literally forced it to regenerate the pixels with its neural network. And my point is that, we've now got all these other data sets that for the first time, we're going to see these sort of multimodal, sort of inductive neural networks is what I've described it as. And I have a white paper that's out right now that people have given me really great feedback on. But the takeaway is that we're sort of at the phase of just building the GPT for, the ecosystem.
So you're really talking about a new form of neural network and machine learning that is different than the GPTs.
It is. Yeah. I mean, we're actually using the transformer model that the GPT model is based on. It's just the way that we're wiring things It's totally different. And I think the one thing that's totally different is this sort of physics inspired, put real space timestamps on everything and tie all of your data together with that. So it's really a physics model, or it's something much more oriented and grounded in the real world. It's not just some video or some image.
It's much more likely to understand ecology than...
It's a simulator.
Yeah.
And so the reason why I wanted to kind of establish the sort of two things. One is, I'm talking with my students last week, and I'm like, guys, you should expect that this is going to have really dramatic and spectacular sort of inference capabilities across your different data sets. And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, no, but just get ready. Because I think basically, you're going to be able to sort of infer things that you would have never thought from different data sets. They are sort of forcefully predictive of what, another data set must be. I think there's going to be some new connections across different scientific fields. Without getting too vague, I would just say that all of this is great. It helps us to answer the question of is the species pollinating on June 2nd in 2029, and is it servicing that butterfly? That's still what you're doing here, is you're able to sort of fill in those data sets that you have sparse information for, but you do have some information. But what I really want to say is this: the thing that most excites me is going from what we think of as this GPT, which is it's just the sort of completing the sentence of the ecology data, meaning we have the language of these data sets. It's like a different language, but it's still like language in that it's just data that needs to be masked and completed, and you can do the same thing. It's the same exact technique, but my point is that there's a little bit of innovation there, but there's the same technique at the core. And all I'm saying is this: I'm most excited to go from the sort of GPT to the chat GPT of ecology, neural networks, where this neural network can predict that there's pollination. It can predict that there's, things that we have data for. But then we start to train it to do things that I think are going to blow the minds of a lot of people and really change the world, basically. That's that fine-tuning stage.
So describe this in layman's term to people who might be listening in terms of the types of tools that you can build with this technology and how they're going to serve the world in creating more high-functioning ecosystems.
It's fantastic. So first of all, it's like a miracle. I think if there weren't examples like ChatGPT, no one would believe me that that this is possible, right? I think it would be like I'm talking some nonsense gibberish that's not just technically complex, but like impossible. No one would believe it's possible. But ChatGPT has shown us that something is different, right? We sort of know that the fabric of the universe is different. There's like these smart machines that are speaking like us. They're thinking like us. How is this happening? And so I sort of have to stop and reinforce that, we are building on something much bigger than what any of us could have ever expected. This was a surprise for all of us in the field as well. We didn't expect this. But basically, you start to be like, I love that question, because it's really kind of like, hey, how can all of the sort of, let's say, policymakers and, partners in landscaping and designers and, there's sort of a whole array of people who, in your wonderful world that I'm so grateful to be in with you now, they're looking to you for leadership, through the outside collaborative and so forth. And my point is that, I have tremendous respect and admiration for all of these people and what they do. I would say Chris Haidt is sort of like, Lance, it's a tool. She's like, it's a tool, that's going to improve these sort of abilities of, let's say, for starters, landscape designers. So it's nice to have a sort of clear, immediate focus. There's obviously, where are we 5 years from now? We could talk about that. But I think right now, where we are today is we have a tool that has a model of native plants in Central Florida. And we have a tool that, you capture these 3D models, and basically we are in the process of doing what I said, which is to sort of take that DeepEarth model and combine it with your site survey, your 3D ecological digital twin. We'll have, it will, that model of predicting whether your plants are going to grow and be pollinated, and let's say maximizing biodiversity, maximizing climate resilience. These are two things. I was actually talking with an AI bot that one of my friends built, and she sent it to me, and she's like, can you take this survey from the Ikigai bot? And Ikigai is this Japanese concept of like kind of finding your calling with what the world needs and with what you're good at and with what you love. And this chatbot was giving me advice on how I should pitch this stuff. And the chatbot was talking to me, and I was talking with the chatbot, and it's this like British sounding chatbot, and she's like, Lance, she's like, you need to tell people that DeepEarth will create, will help us to design, new communities that effectively have more habitat connectivity. This is something that you can design and you can optimize. And that being, you go down the list of maybe what you might think of as the sort of major, especially ecological design objectives of landscape architects, who I just admire to no end. I just think they have such a hard problem, and I feel like so many people in this world are just like, okay, well, let the landscape architect solve it. And having like now closely engaged with these people, I feel for them deeply, because I'm just like, oh my God, like you're trying to solve that kind of scientific modeling problem and like 12 others at the same time. Well, like, first of all, no wonder why you work so slow. But I just think they have such integrity to sort of stand up for what's right. And so they're going to, it's this very integrative discipline. And my point is that the first thing that we're going to do, the very first thing that we're super 100% committed in, and again, Chris Hite, Cody Smith, and folks who have been so influential with what we're doing, Chris Hite also being co-founder of the Outside Collaborative, we're going to provide this tool for all of, the landscape architects in the country. And it's going to assist them with solving these objectives and measuring out these ecological impacts. And it's a creative tool. I love to say this. It's not going to tell you what to do. If you want to press a button and get something out of it, fine. But I don't think that's what the architects want to do. I think they just want to have the scientific simulation capabilities. And so that's why we realize, okay, what we do best is sort of science and scientific modeling. And then we're just going to put this into the hands of the architects. And if they go ahead and create the landscape with like no butterflies and all these things, like we've kind of failed. But at least the point is it's a creative tool.
So it's like an AI collaborator for landscape architects to help them make better design choices based on the DeepEarth model, the 3D digital twin, and the site-specific data that you're able to connect, and that would make it more likely for landscape architects to create really stellar and amazing landscapes that go back to the High Line, go back to creating these highly functional ecosystems that draw people in, that make people want to stay, that make people feel good, and that create value and ultimately raise real estate values.
Which I think is that last but not least factor, because, Google didn't get to be Google by sort of being a charity or, by being shy about making money. And I had to sort of realize, like, I'm not going to sort of, it's the opposite of sort of hiding behind this idea that, I want to like build real estate value. It's like, we're going to make our money through the real estate markets. I mean, we need a tool. I'm still understanding exactly how this is going to work. It needs to be something that the landscape architects, first of all, makes them better at what they do, accelerates, removes the trivia, removes the sort of mundane tasks, and instantly puts them in their creative space and empowers them to be more effective and more confident and more bold in their designs. Because when you sort of can not worry about the science, you're probably creatively focused on serving people more effectively and so forth. So the point is, like, we're really focused on the design aspect. I mean, that's our core strength. There's no question about it. And you don't sort of get to sort of walk away from that and then not solve that successfully. I'm saying that's our strength. But I think ultimately this could be something exactly like you said, that is sort of, let's just say we're being pulled in to real estate development projects because, first of all, we demonstrate, prove, really actually optimize this industrial system. So that way, effectively, these returns are reliably generated at scale. And I think at that point, what you'll see is basically, a very large number of development projects sort of insisting that these tools are used. basically.
Well, I think that's probably what we want to optimize for, ask the AI to help us optimize for, and that is how do we maximize economic returns to stakeholders, purse string holders, and decision makers for making better ecological choices in the design and implementation of the landscapes.
Right.
In other words, how do we tie the capitalistic economic motive to the business of ecological enhancement and restoration?
Yeah.
Because when you get it working through free market incentives and you provide economic framework for people to act in alignment with these ecological goals, you're going to get very rapid investment and development.
Suddenly you're unlocking all of that human creativity, ingenuity.
It goes.
All of the industries, Sam's great, soil enhancer from the worm castings, all of these people, working towards the unified objective of sort of enhancing our ecosystems, and the point being, like I sort of describe this as the greatest sort of miracle as far as the environment and wildlife is concerned, because no one's representing the wildlife.
Yeah, who speaks for the bees and the
We just happen
pollinators
to
and the
like
birds?
them deep down. So
Well, that's
one perspective.
Well, I think that this is the key to the conversation, because
Yeah.
the premise is that and this is Doug Tallamy's premise, is that there's a tremendous amount of land that is in private hands that is dedicated to the residential land use, and those lands are not necessarily being put to work in service of wildlife, because they are not being designed and constructed and managed to function as quality ecosystems. We cannot rely solely on the preserved state, federal lands, the national parks,
or the sort of goodwill of these landowners,
or the goodwill of landowners.
But if you're offering something that would sort of be that ecological pill for them to take, that also increases their net worth.
Right. So to transform all of this land that is in residential land use to high functioning ecosystem and make it a free market incentive, a motive that people want to do it.
Well, I think if you can prove that by implementing this ecological planting scheme or whatever, that it's going to increase
property values.
We see the data, but
reduce
most
maintenance
people
cost.
Don't have that proof, right? So if you start literally down the street, Bill, whoa, did you see what happened to Bill's lawn? Like, not sort of like food lawns or whatever, right? We're talking about, something that I realized is not just restoring ecosystems or just bringing science or whatever. Design, bringing in landscape design, state-of-the-art landscape design, building tools to accelerate and truly make the landscape designers' potential number of projects that they execute. We're talking not just about someone just randomly making gardens, right? We're talking about professionals like Chris Height. Can you actually expand literally the impact of Chris Height by 10x or 100x over the next 5 years? I think the answer is yes.
You can with this design tool that you're building.
Getting at with that, which is very simple, is that you sort of have these different capacities to actually start entering these markets that you never thought a landscape architect would be able to enter into at scale. Like the small homeowner who, the landscape architect is too expensive. But now because of these technologies, you have the potential to suddenly service, these houses down the street. And so you're getting these amazing designs potentially. And by the way, this is labor intensive. There's still a whole landscaping industry behind it, which is not going away. It's going to only grow in my opinion. So that's sort of, I'm just saying that's sort of like a market that, is sort of crucial to all of this, is that all of these tools plug in with the contractors and so forth. But the big point that I'm getting at is basically, you have this opportunity to suddenly start addressing not just new housing projects, but also all of the sort of environmental devastation that we're currently looking at. Every time you drive down one of these, I describe it as a nuclear wasteland.
Sure.
Of sort of ecological
Well, as soon as people start to pay attention to those degraded lands, and there's enough will and capital to restore those lands, we're going to need tools to understand how best to do that. And I think that what you're developing with DeepEarth and these design tools could be
It could help.
Could be useful there.
Yeah.
But what I'm most excited about is just this idea of optimizing for ecological function and to creating more landscapes that really perform in that you have life thriving in the garden. You have pollinators, you have a diversity of plants, you have plants that are healthy because they're in the right place. You have all of these synergies that happen in an ecosystem when you get these system level effects of health.
The hummingbirds are in the tree canopy.
Hummingbirds,
when you're coming to visit the
you get the wafting aroma of sweet blooms and the sound of the rustling of the leaves. This whole kind of 3D immersive effect of a great landscape.
Yeah.
And then you can do that reliably and at scale. What I predict is going to happen is that the real estate developers who latch onto this idea and who are able to partner with Chris Hyde or with people who are empowered by these tools, they're going to be successful in a way that we've never seen before.
I think so.
And creating communities for sale, right?
Yeah,
because they're in the business of selling homes.
That's right.
Communities for sale that are just going to be so far,
so beautiful,
above and beyond
it's just be beautiful.
The competition. So much better.
Yeah, because you're just you're designing for so many more of the things that we instinctively need.
People instinctively are drawn to. They can't put a word to it.
That's
they can't tell you that this is what they're shopping for.
You're going to show up in this community, and I think there's one thing of it's interesting that I love visiting. I always love visiting you here because I just. I tell my friends, you look down, there's rolling hills of large trees that are growing healthy that could show up, in downtown, Claremont, tomorrow. And the point is that, so there's this idea that, okay, you want to plant young, but, some of these places can literally become lush, vibrant ecosystems once they're established. You also taught me about this concept. Ecosystem establishment, and others have as well, but we sort of talked a little bit about, how you don't really right away get this effect the moment you plant the tree that people are going to interpret that as thriving. And I do think, coming back to Rainer with us for a second, it's probably once it starts to, new leaves are sprouted, once you start to have flowering and these kinds of things, and it's new flowers, and then the hummingbirds are showing up.
But it can be done on a reasonable time scale.
Yeah, it's like a year or two.
A year or two. But the point I'm making is that when these tools are rolled out,
I'm glad you got it.
And when people avail themselves of these technologies and actually implement the high quality, high line quality landscaping at scale in master plan community development, those communities are going to far outperform.
I would want to live in it.
Yes, you would want to live in it. A lot of people will.
Yeah.
And so they're going to outperform the competition in terms of the velocity of home sales, or what people refer to as the absorption rate of inventory, the average price that they sell for, and then
that's the one that you start to look into. But you also pay attention to eco gentrification and these things, just to say that. But I think the fact is, in the free market, you're going to see these housing projects because there's no competition for them. Because there's so little competition in that market, you're going to see the ability to charge very high prices. And this is maybe sort of what I like to call the sort of Tesla Roadster, because it's important to understand that our goal is not... I think it's great to sort of,
But I don't think I don't think it necessarily leads to gentrification. I guess the point I want to make is that it's going to lead to imitation and replication, because everybody wants to be successful and competitive, and when they see an innovation take root and provide success, and yes, there's a first mover advantage, some extra margins at the beginning, it becomes standard because people start to say, okay, well, I need to do that too, and guess what? These tools are available and can scale.
The whole idea is to, I think right now, for example, we have this service that's the starting foundation for it. So it's great when you have traction and you're actually starting to see, how do you make these ideas work. Really thrilled to say that, it starts with a site survey. This is something that I'll just say, over the course of the next month and a half, something like this, we know we're going to sort of have this sort of national launch. And basically all I'm getting at is that it's a very simple service that starts with, okay, let us go ahead and fly that drone around your site. Let's run DeepEarth on your site, because by the way, DeepEarth is such a computationally expensive model that we're not just going to go ahead and compute the microclimates in the middle of Arizona or something like this for no reason. We're not just going to arbitrarily compute at extremely high resolution everywhere on the planet because we don't have that power. I don't even think Google does, is my point. So, you get to sort of, for a service, you get to sort of run these extremely high precision, high accuracy scientific simulations for these customers, and that's a software service. But basically it starts with also guaranteeing that you get that photorealistic 3D model, that digital twin, where the designers can work in as well. And so that's something that, we get to say, it's here. Like, we basically have the core of that tool. In the beginning, it's really just that plant palette recommendation that's ecologically viable. It's sort of fit for the microclimate according to its, is it full shade, partial shade? Does it alkaline soil? Or, there's questions that a landscape architect would need to go through. And right now we're just going to instantly surface that for all of the designers basically for their projects. So the moment you show up to design, you're welcome to go visit the site and, understand the spirit of the site and do what you want to do. But I'm just thinking of some designers who describe this spiritual moment of being on the site, and they're like naked on the site and just with nature or something. This is a funny thinking of one person in particular at Dick's Height. But basically, it's nice to say that in any case, you'll have this digital twin that when you go back to the office in the air conditioning, which most people enjoy in Florida, you'll still be able to be on the site. It really feels immersive when you spend a lot of time in the space, kind of zooming around.
Yeah,
I feel like I've been to these places so many times that I have these digital twins of, and so I think basically that's an offering that we have now. It's a solved problem. It's done, and we can also make it so that the moment you come back to your digital twin, you're not asking the question, but does the drainage flow this way or that way? The scientific model is answering that question for you. And you're not asking the question, but can I use these plant species or that plant species? Already you're just clicking on different parts of the site and immediately surfaces your planting palette. And at that point, we let you do what you do best, basically. You're envisioning things that you want there. This is just where we are today.
right. So where does this go next in terms of how you scale this business and the ideas that you have?
Yeah.
Is this something you need to go and raise capital for? What
For sure.
What scale of a development team do you require?
Well, I mentioned that this idea of having 200 PhD students behind me sounds extremely compelling, because I realized what I can do with 5 last week, and it was spectacular. So, I don't think I've ever worked with such talented people in such a high concentration who are all like, Lance, tell us what to do. And so that was thanks to the National Science Foundation for sort of gifting me with that experience. My point is that I'm basically going to, everything we've talked about, and also this, sort of workforce that I want to build out, where, we hire sort of the best and the brightest in AI and ecological sciences. This is sort of what I had last week. So I sort of know what the little formula is, the little SWAT team that we had. We had a guy in hydrological and climate sciences who also has a background in AI. We had someone who's, you go down the list of these different disciplines that we brought together, because the whole theme of this NSF program was convergent science. So this is thesis at the National Science Foundation that all of the sciences should come together, which I think AI is an appropriate sort of foundation for that to happen. So they have this AI program for convergent science. And so that's why I have this a beautiful slide of this professor who I mentioned to you, who's just father figure for me right now in terms of academia. He's supporting DeepEarth thoroughly, and he's the reason why we've been getting funding for this stuff. And basically, there's a slide where he's behind him, he's this genius. He's the dean of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, College of Liberal Arts and Sciences or something like this. He's a big deal, but he's got all of these academic disciplines and industrial fields listed behind him, and he's yeah, we're going to integrate all of them. I'm just cool, but where I'm going with all of that is, that was for me a sort of microcosm of what I need to do next. I need to basically, sort of understand what are the teams that I need to form. These are things that I've sort of been doing on my own or with working with folks. Let's just say I'm very grateful for some collaborators that we've had, who've been really moving this forward. So I'll just say that basically once you sort of establish the market, the product, I think I'm happy to say we're sort of like very early stage pre-revenue, but I think like this week we could be post-revenue. So it's a very exciting place to be. We're seeing traction very, very fast right now. And my point is that I think I'm just looking to sort of really put a bow tie on this for investors, because I want every investor to fully, like, there's so much risk that has already been, minimized or crushed. And then there's just like the last little questions that I'm like, I'll just do my job and finish up this business, and make sure that it's like thoroughly ready to scale, because that's typically what an investor wants to see. They're not looking typically to invest in science. So yeah, I'm just saying it's probably, I would say could be another couple weeks. It could be a month or two, I don't know. But there are some very large contracts actually that we're looking at. I haven't disclosed it yet. So I'll just say that we have some opportunities in Silicon Valley for Firewise landscaping. And I'm happy to say this. I don't think I'm going to ruin anything by saying basically the fire chief of the city of Berkeley gave me a call and asked me, hey, could you build an AI system to help people re-landscape their not fire resilient landscape? And could you make it something that could scale across, let's say, he gave me a list. It was like, I want to say it was like 2,000 or 3,000 different houses in like a little micro neighborhood on this urban wildland interface. And where I'm going with this is that we might have like a large contract with the city of Berkeley working with the fire department. Stuff like this, in my mind, is sort of, it's nice to sort of put revenue in the bank, basically, again, speaking humbly as an entrepreneur. But, all of this in my mind is basically about, it's all coming together as sort of AI tools that collaborate with landscape architects, landscape designers, integrate ecological sciences, and have that 3D ecological digital twin platform through which, we can sort of plug into potentially, consider landscaping at the scale of millions and hundreds of millions of houses, and so forth. That's the potential that we have, obviously. But it's, I'm very humble to say it has to start in certain places. So I'm like, okay, well, let's demonstrate this with a few projects that are actually, totally successful at this point. So again, very humble.
Yeah, wow, this is fascinating and my head's spinning.
Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate you really diving deep with me and helping me understand the science behind the work that you're doing. And I'm really excited to see where this goes next.
Thanks.
And
yeah, well, it's been a super pleasure. Thank you for your vision. I just want to thank you personally, and also I think the sort of community that you've been helping to organize, all of these truly brilliant, passionate people about having a good impact on the environment. I'm very grateful to have found sort of my own tribe, truly. I know I'm like this black goose or something like this, with this AI background, but I know that there are these sort of bigger things that we talked about. I'm happy to talk about them, but I think all I'm trying to say is that I'm 100% committed to translating this for the things that we talked about, expanding ecological function, and I'm also open-minded. I think there's always been some surprising turns of how things go, so I'm ready to sort of move on.
Yeah, you're ready to be surprised, which is always a good thing.
Yeah.
But I think there is a large community of people who are passionate about ecological restoration and seeing us make huge strides in the coming years towards improving our environments, our natural resource management, our ecosystems. And I believe that they are going to be thrilled to hear that there's someone like you in the world who is bringing all of the power of artificial intelligence, machine learning, 3D models to the fight. Because we know how important it is to leverage and avail ourselves of these technologies if we really want to accelerate. And I think a lot of people in this community know a lot about plants, they may know a lot about soils, they may know a lot about water and how ecosystems work, but surely not a lot of them know as much as you do about artificial intelligence.
I'm glad you didn't say ecology.
Well, nobody knows anything about ecology.
That's the joke. No, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Tim. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Lance.
Oh, absolute pleasure. Yeah, super cool.